The rain tapped gently against the window pane, a soft rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Evelyn's days. She sat in the armchair by the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her eyes were fixed on the door across the room. It was her son's bedroom door, slightly ajar as it always was. She could see the faint glow of a lamp inside, casting a warm, golden light onto the hallway floor. Ethan had always been a quiet boy, preferring the company of books to people. His room was a sanctuary of stories, shelves lined with novels, encyclopedias, and tattered comic books. He would spend hours there, lost in worlds far beyond their small town. Evelyn had always admired his love for reading, though she sometimes wished he would step outside more, breathe in the fresh air, and make friends his age. But that was before the accident. It had been a rainy night, much like this one. Ethan had been on his way home from the library, his backpack heavy with books. The driver of the car hadn't seen him crossing the street. The impact had been instant, the paramedics said. There was no pain. Evelyn had clung to those words in the days that followed, though they offered little comfort. The funeral had been a blur. She remembered the somber faces of family and friends, the flowers, the eulogies. She remembered the ache in her chest, the emptiness that seemed to swallow her whole. But as the weeks passed, something strange began to happen. The memories of the funeral grew hazy, as if they were slipping through her fingers. When she tried to recall who had attended or what had been said, her mind drew a blank. Even the obituary she had written for the local newspaper seemed to have vanished, as if it had never existed. And then there was Ethan. At first, she thought it was her grief playing tricks on her. She would hear the soft rustle of pages turning in his room, the creak of his chair as he shifted positions. She would catch glimpses of him out of the corner of her eye, sitting at his desk, his head bent over a book. But when she turned to look, the room would be empty, the chair still, the desk untouched. But the sounds persisted. And then, one evening, she saw him. She had been walking past his room when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of Ethan's laughter, soft and melodic. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she pushed the door open, her hands trembling. There he was, sitting cross-legged on his bed, a book open in his lap. He looked up at her, his eyes bright, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mom," he said, his voice just as she remembered it. "You should read this one. It's really good." Evelyn's knees buckled and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream, to cry out, to demand an explanation. But all she could do was stare at him, her son, alive and whole, as if nothing had happened. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How?" But he simply smiled and returned to his book, as if her question needed no answer. From that day on, Ethan was there, every evening, reading in his room. Evelyn would sit with him sometimes, watching him turn the pages, listening to him hum softly under his breath. She didn't understand how it was possible, but she didn't care. Her son was here, and that was all that mattered. But as the days turned into weeks, Evelyn began to notice things. The house felt colder, even with the fire roaring in the hearth. The shadows in the hallway seemed darker, longer, as if they were stretching toward her. And then there were the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They grew louder at night, filling the silence with a sense of unease. One evening, as she sat with Ethan, she noticed something strange. The book he was reading had no title on the cover, and the pages were filled with symbols she didn't recognize. The letters twisted and shifted as if they were alive. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He turned the pages with the same enthusiasm as always, his eyes scanning the strange text. "Ethan," she said cautiously, "what are you reading?" He looked up at her, his expression serene. "It's a story about a boy who never left," he said. "It's really good. You should read it." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She reached out to take the book from him, but as her fingers brushed the cover, a jolt of cold shot through her arm. She recoiled, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling, "what's happening? What is this?" But he didn't answer. He simply closed the book and set it aside, then lay down on his bed, his eyes drifting shut. Within moments, he was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Evelyn sat there for a long time, staring at her son, her mind racing. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't her Ethan. Not really. Whatever was in his room, whatever was reading those books, it wasn't her son. The next morning, she went to the library, determined to find answers. She searched through every book on the supernatural, the afterlife, anything that might explain what was happening. But the more she read, the more confused she became. There were stories of ghosts, of spirits trapped between worlds, but none of them seemed to fit. And then she found it, a small, dusty book tucked away in the corner of the library. The title was faded, but she could just make out the words, "The Boy Who Never Left." Her hands shook as she opened the book. The pages were filled with the same strange symbols she had seen in Ethan's room. But as she stared at them, the symbols began to shift and change, forming words she could understand. "The boy who never left is not a boy at all," the book said. "He is a memory, a fragment of a life cut short. He lingers in the places he loved, bound by the emotions of those who remember him. But beware, for the longer he stays, the more he consumes. The shadows grow darker, the whispers louder, until there is nothing left but him." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She slammed the book shut and hurried home, her mind racing. She had to make Ethan leave. She had to let him go. That evening, she sat with him in his room, her heart heavy with grief. "Ethan," she said softly, "it's time to go." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke her heart. "But I don't want to leave," he said. "I like it here." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But you can't stay. It's not right." For a long moment he was silent. Then he nodded, his expression resigned. He closed the book he had been reading and set it aside, then stood up and walked to the door. He paused, looking back at her one last time. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I love you too," she whispered. And then he was gone. The room felt empty, colder than it had before. Evelyn sat there for a long time, staring at the empty bed, the closed book. The shadows in the hallway seemed to recede, the whispers fading into silence. Ethan was gone, but this time she knew he wasn't coming back. The rain continued to fall outside, a gentle, steady rhythm. Evelyn sat in her armchair, her knitting needles still in her hands, though she wasn't knitting. She stared at the closed door of Ethan's room, her heart aching with the grief she knew would never fully heal. But she also felt a sense of peace, Ethan was free now, and though she would always miss him, she knew he was where he belonged. Somewhere beyond the shadows, beyond the whispers, in a place where he could read to his heart's content, forever lost in the stories he loved so much.